Okay, we're going to start at verse 14 because it's going to be very relevant as we continue on with the rest of our study. We will, Lord willing, be able to finish up in Daniel chapter 2 today, but it's going to feel or seem like, well, we left out details, but we won't, because the very particulars of this statue and of these kingdoms that it speaks about, we will get into the next chapters. We are going to see the sovereign rule of God Almighty as it's been depicted and revealed to us, that He raises kings and takes them down. There is nothing out of His control that He does not do according to His purpose and according to His plan. And starting in verse 14, it says this: Then Daniel replied with discretion and discernment to Arioch, the captain of the king's bodyguards, who had gone forth to slay the wise men of Babylon. He said to Arioch, the king's commander, "For what reason is the decree from the king so urgent?" He asked the question. So, picking up on what it says in verse 14, where it says that Daniel used discretion and discernment. We want to keep that in mind as we continue forward in the rest of our text. And you guys remember what took place with that. They seek the Lord, and oh, there we go. Quick interruption. Here we have Doughboy.
Yes.
This here is a few years back actually. Nebuchadnezzar, one study that we did when we were studying this, and it was determined that it would be best to just, for me to put little timelines on here. So I just made this little chart literally at the study. So during the teaching, we were able to refer to it. So this is what we're referring to, and it's been around ever since. Doesn't really matter what's on here, but this is all the timelines for Israel, for the Gentile nations, that they're supposed to represent the statue with the folded arms, the head of gold, and we named him Doughboy because of the way he looks, Manny and I. This is the only artwork that I did over the years. Manny does all the other artwork, and he did a real fine job. You guys remember when he'd get up there and he'd make the temples and all those things. So anyway, thanks, Nico. Nico had his copy of Doughboy, so I'll make sure this gets back to you. So that's what we're referring to. Okay, let's get back to this here and really focus on what's going on. That Daniel used discretion and discernment, and he was given wisdom on how to go about this with dealing with his circumstances, goes to his friends and says, listen, we need to go before the Lord. Now, these are the three friends that are trusted, which is important, to Daniel himself, because among all the others, he has no status, and they're going to be looking down on him like he doesn't really count. And we see how God, in these circumstances, takes the lesser, the least of the least, and raises him all the way to the top. How do we know? How do we know that that's what took place? Is because when they prayed, if you guys remembered, verse 19, then the mystery was revealed to Daniel in a night vision. Then Daniel blessed the God of heaven. Daniel said, let the name of God be blessed forever and ever, for wisdom and power belong to Him. It is He who changes the times and the epochs, which is blocks of time that are much longer. Remember that? Epochs are, it's a lengthy time period, and He controls the times from which we live in. And once one is finished, it gives way to another. From John the Baptist, he finished up the law and the prophets. Then it went to New Testament and Christ and the New Covenant. That one ended with the death of John the Baptist, and then it goes into another. When we get to the pre-tribulation rapture, that ends the church age. So that's a way to give an example on how it works. And that's what the time periods are like. Now you want to put yourself in Daniel's position here. He's in captivity, he's exiled, and think like you or Daniel. Remember, as we go through this book, it's revealed to Daniel as we go through. We're going to see that he's bewildered by the things that he's receiving. He lacks understanding. And then he's given understanding and interpretations, but it still makes no sense to him. There's a time when he receives it, and it's just so, to him, basically, excuse me, to him, basically, he's just completely stressed trying to figure these things out, but he can't. And he literally just keeps it to himself. And these are things coming to him from the Lord. So he's under this duress, but he's trusting the Lord. And he says that, you know, his understanding just wasn't there at one point. And he says, so I took these things because they were pretty terrifying to him. And he said, and I just kept them to myself. But it's revealed in the scripture. So put yourself in Daniel's shoes, that as he's going through all these things, he's trusting the Lord all through everything. But there's another great point about Daniel that we want to understand, that we learn from, that is really edifying for us. And that's what the scriptures are for, is to see how it is that we understand and how it is that we walk in a relationship with the Lord. Because that's what Daniel did in trusting the Lord. Okay, so finishing off on verse 21, he changes times and epochs, he removes kings and establishes kings, he gives wisdom to the wise man and knowledge to men of understanding, which Daniel falls into that category. So God gives the wisdom to those that are raised up, applying that wisdom that God has given them, and it shines unto others. And knowledge to men of understanding. Understanding what things mean according to the word when you appraise things spiritually, first and foremost with God, which does not make sense to the world. Okay? It is he who reveals profound and hidden things, which it's coming from God. He's creator of all things and he's sovereign. And he reveals them to those that he desires. He knows what's in the darkness, and the light dwells with him. To you, O God, of my fathers, I give thanks and praise, for you have given me wisdom and power. Even now you have made known to me what we requested of you. For you have made known to us, in reference to his friends, the king's matter. So all of them are aware of it. It was revealed to Daniel. But the point that we want to look at here is in verse 23. We see that he used wisdom and discretion. And we see in verse 23, in the middle of that verse, for you have given me wisdom and power. We want to remember that. Now, we want to fast forward to where we ended off last week. You guys remember, Arioch runs to the king and says, hey, I found a man. That's last week's study. So we want to look at the discretion and remember that discretion and the wisdom that he used, okay? And we also want to look at the wisdom and the power that was given to him. And keep that in mind as we go through the rest of our text. So if you weren't able to be with us last week's study, as we continue on, we're going to pick it up, because now we're going to get into the actual interpretation of this dream. And last week we ended up going through, but as for me, the mystery is not because it's of Daniel. I'm trying to remember the exact verse we left off on, but you do also remember that there was purpose behind everything that was revealed to Daniel. And in the book of Daniel, as it goes over those ages and those time periods, the most important thing is that it stretches, and we need to understand what the interpretation is of how that works within the statue itself. So the statue that we're going to go over right now, this statue, it stands, rather than being something that you lay out and begin to show a block of time in a direction on a chart, as we would commonly do, say, okay, it starts here, and then the next thing you're going to see is this, and then the next thing that's going to happen after that certain time period is this, as we would move forward along this graph or chart. So picture this statue being that chart, but it's upright. And that's what you have. Okay? And it starts with King Nebuchadnezzar. King Nebuchadnezzar, 605, and working through the time period between 605 and 603. And you guys remember in our past studies here that Nebuchadnezzar has rule after taking over Jerusalem, and that was the first time it was ever done. Okay, we went through the whole Assyrian thing and all those things, past studies. Now at this point they've been captured, and you guys remember the 3 points that must take place where all things are complete. It's that the exiles, they're scattered throughout all of the nations of the land. They must all be in Israel, and that's not taken place. Okay? And Israel, the city of Jerusalem, must be under Jewish control. So if those 3 factors are not happening, you are within a time period, which is known as what? How many different types of peoples are there in the world? Jews and Gentiles, right? So therefore, having those 2 different people groups, a Jew and Jerusalem, is under the oppression and the trampling of the Gentiles. And it started with Nebuchadnezzar. So what we want to ask ourselves is, when will that end? How does that work according to the scripture? And that's what we get into with the statue. So laying that foundation right now, we're going to see how that works, and it's through those time periods on the statue. Does that make sense? Okay. That's just the introduction so that we are focused, sorry you guys, focused on the text that we're reading. So anyways, don't worry, I'm not sick, you guys. I think you know I got Barrett's and it just gets dried out. So anyways, so if I have to take a sip of water, it's because it's affecting my throat. But no worries, let's carry on. So we understand that. We understand what the purpose of the statue is. And Daniel, we're reflecting back on the wisdom that he's been given. All of this moves into, we'll start off in verse 31, and we're going to go all the way to the end. We studied this last week, I believe. I don't remember exactly which scripture we left off with, because I believe that we went through the statue itself, but we're just going to briefly go through the statue itself, then its interpretation, okay? Starting at verse 31. So, we're up to the point now where the dream is going to be revealed to Nebuchadnezzar. We know that Daniel's received it. And now he goes to the king, and he's going to reveal that dream. Okay, starting at verse 31, it starts with, "You, O king, were looking, and behold." Remember, he said earlier, he said to the king, your thoughts came into your mind, you were wondering what was going to happen into the future. Okay, and those things we already kind of went over before in the other studies. Okay, so verse 31, "You, O king, were looking, and behold, there was a single great statue. That statue, which was large and extraordinarily splendor, was standing in front of you, and its appearance was awesome." Verse 32, "The head of that statue was made of fine gold, its breast and its arms of silver, its belly and its thighs of bronze." Verse 33, "Its legs of iron, its feet partly of iron and partly of clay. You continued looking until a stone was cut out without hands, and it struck the statue on its feet of iron and clay, and crushed them. Then the iron and the clay and the bronze and the silver and the gold were crushed all at the same time, and became like chaff from the summer threshing floors. And the wind carried them away, so that not a trace of them were found. But the stone that struck the statue became a great mountain and filled the whole earth." So we're going to break this portion down briefly as Daniel interprets what he saw and gives the details of what took place in this dream. And at this point, Nebuchadnezzar is receiving knowing, because God is working on both sides, knowing that he's given him an accurate depiction of what he saw. So, "You, O king, were looking, and behold, there was a single great statue." Okay, that single great statue, starting as we just got done talking about, it starts from the top. And what the statue is timelines as it moves its way down. And we're going to see that within the interpretation that Daniel gives. So he tells him what he sees. And remember, it's going from top to bottom. Okay? And when we get to the conclusion, going through these time periods, which that's what this is speaking about and what he's seen. Okay? As we get to the conclusions of all of these time periods, we notice that it turns to the supernatural. And we want to keep that in mind also. So these points that we're to keep in mind, we'll be able to, as we continue and finish the rest of the text, be able to plug them in, and you'll see it come alive. Okay, verse 36. "This was the dream. Now we will tell you its interpretation before the king. You, O king, are the King of kings, to whom the God of heaven has given the kingdom, the power and the strength and the glory. And wherever the sons of men dwell, or beast of the field, or the birds of the sky, he has given them into your hand, and has caused you to rule over them all. You are the head of gold. So it starts off with the head of gold, and that interpretation points directly to Nebuchadnezzar himself. But you notice what Daniel reveals to him. He says, you are the King of Kings, meaning you have entire rule. There is no one to challenge your authority. Now, if you guys remember in our references a couple of studies back, being that Nebuchadnezzar, although he does not worship God, he worships pagan gods. Although he does not at this time belong to the Lord, but in God's sovereignty and in God's purpose, he has given Jerusalem and the Jewish nation, Judah, into the hand of Nebuchadnezzar. And not only did he give the Jews into them, because he is the first one to be able to breach the walls of Jerusalem. And as he did, you guys remember in Jeremiah 27, where we went over and the scripture said that Nebuchadnezzar is the servant of the Lord to do the Lord's will, and that he is the one that has given in to the hands of Nebuchadnezzar Jerusalem. Okay? So we keep that in mind, and he says, you are the head of gold. But notice what he says there. He says, you're the King of Kings, and the kingdom and the power and the strength and the glory, and wherever the sons of men dwell, or the beast of the field, or the birds of the sky, he has given them into your hand and has caused you to rule over them all. You are the head of gold. Now, what does that mean that he's given the birds of the sky and every beast and every kingdom, and he's the King of Kings? This is entire world rule. There's nothing to challenge his authority. So when you look at Nebuchadnezzar, does that mean that he goes everywhere? And it says that wherever the sons of men dwell. What that means is complete hierarchy, authority over everywhere and everything in the entire world. Now, is Nebuchadnezzar going to be able to get on a horse and travel the entire world? The answer is no. It just means that any place and every place that he travels to, everything that he does, it's a monarchy in the sense that this, remember we spoke about it last week, he doesn't have the prime ministers or any of those and the governors outside that are going to challenge him that have any rule over authority. And that goes with every other nation that is out there. So for this time period, he's in complete control. And that means even the beast and the fowl of the air, which means literally during this time that God has decreed him as being in this position in the world, that nothing is going to remove him from that. If he went on a safari and went to Africa, and there's a wild lion there, and he gets caught in the middle of a den of lions, they're not going to do anything to King Nebuchadnezzar. He is protected. He has absolute authority and protection wherever he goes. And that's by the decree of God Almighty. So you want to keep that in mind with his sovereign purpose and what is being accomplished. It is God who has given this authority to him. We really want to make that specific, okay? And it says so right there, the kingdom, the power, the strength, and the glory, and wherever the sons of men dwell, or the beast of the field, or the birds of the sky, he has given them into your hand, and has caused you to rule over them all. Now that's pretty incredible. That's very incredible with the authority that he has. And what we are painting is a picture, being futurist, as we'll see the scriptures come together in the literal sense, meaning this, that this also is the beginning, the painting, and the revealing of that is to come in the future. And what we see through this statue, beginning with Nebuchadnezzar, let's call it 605, 603, 602, in that general area. We'll get into, there were some wars that set that whole stage as well that took place. And that's the way that it became. Nebuchadnezzar is this picture, since this is talking about a time of the end, and it's showing us timelines of blocks, long blocks of time, giving way to another block of time. That's what this picture and this statue represents, starting with him. So as it moves forward, we see that he has complete authority, and this is beginning to paint the picture symbolically of one that is to come. And when that time comes, a ruler of the entire world remains to be seen, because as we go through this statue, we'll see that that's what's going to take place, and where these Gentile kingdoms will end up and what their demise may be. So everybody good with that so far? In that verse that we just read through 36 and 37 and 38. Okay, verse 39. After you, now Daniel has established, you rule everything. You're the head of gold. And in Babylon, that gold represented high, fine quality. That's the way that they function there. So at this point, Nebuchadnezzar, I'm sure, is just receiving it, just going, wow, because he has that type of pride, as we'll learn. But God deals with that pride as well later, in the right time, according to the Lord's will. At this point, he is not someone who recognizes the God of Israel as being the Most High God. Okay? Verse 39. After you, this is Daniel speaking to Nebuchadnezzar, after you there will arise another kingdom inferior to you, then another third kingdom of bronze, which will rule over all the earth. So we'll read that one more time. We're going to break that down just a bit. After you, speaking of a time to Nebuchadnezzar, you are in complete control, the King of Kings, you rule everything. But after you, there's a time that it's not going to be that way. And it moves to verse 39, after you there will arise another kingdom inferior to you, then another third kingdom of bronze, which will rule over all the earth. So here we see Babylon, and then we see that there is another kingdom that comes after Nebuchadnezzar, which was the Medo-Persian, was two coming together. This is two nations coming together, and they work together, okay? The Medes were the more dominant one, basically, and they basically ran it. But Medo-Persian, you know what Persian is? It's today, modern day Iran. Okay? Now they came together in unity, and that's what's represented on our doughboy by the two arms crossed together. So we've moved down from the head of gold down to the two arms, which represent the unity. That's why the arms are crossed, and most of your statues, they show them crossed that way, but that's these two nations coming together. Now, you notice one thing. It says, you are the head of gold, and after you there will arise another kingdom inferior to you. Now, the way that we know things generally function is, well, you would have to be more powerful than the other. Now, what would it take to be able to rule and take this authority in a practical sense and take this rule away from Nebuchadnezzar, who controls, and he's the king of kings, and that he has even authority over the beast and the fowl of the air? What would it take? Wouldn't it take, it would seem to be a stronger army to be able to do that? Now, what would also have to take place for that to take place? What also would have to take place for that to take place? That means that you have to defeat Babylon. And if you're going to defeat Babylon, then you're ruling in being able to take what Babylon has, which is control of Jerusalem. So he would have to have the ability, talking about the kingdom, to overcome Babylon. So the time was going to come, but yet it's with an inferior army compared to the strength and power of Babylon. Okay? So everybody get that picture? Because it says right there. But this next rule, the second rule, which are the arms, represented by the arms of that statue, it's Medo-Persian, and they united, and they are an inferior army, so to speak, to them. But let's go down a little bit further, and we're going to go through verse 40 also, and we'll speak about the statue as we move down that statue. Okay? And another kingdom will arise, okay, inferior to you, then another kingdom of bronze, which will rule over all the earth. Now this bronze, take a look at what's taking place. Okay, is as it goes down, you have less inferior strength, but the substance gets less. You start with gold, right? And now you're down to bronze. And it continues that way as it goes on, and it's less and less. Now let's continue on in verse 40. We're going to review all this stuff after we read the scripture. Verse 40. Then there will be a fourth kingdom, as strong as iron, inasmuch as iron crushes and shatters all things. So, like iron that breaks into pieces, it will crush and break all these into pieces. Let's just stop right there real quick. Now we're dealing with iron. Now you see that inferior compared to the bronze? when it talks about the bronze, and we see that the bronze is inferior and of lesser value and lesser strength when it comes to those things than in the gold, from gold to the bronze to the iron. And as this iron crushes and breaks all things, it uses its force to, like iron, that breaks in pieces. It will crush all these in pieces. So this iron comes forth. Okay? So you have this center section of bronze, and then what you have is this iron that takes place. And in this fourth kingdom, look what it reads, and it says, it breaks into pieces, all these into pieces, verse 41, in that you saw the feet and the toes, partly of potter's clay and partly of iron. It will be a divided kingdom. But it will have in the toughness of iron, in it, the toughness of iron, inasmuch as you saw the iron mixed with common clay. So let's get a picture of what's taking place here. As you do the rundown through this, we see that the materials become less inferior. But then once you get into this fourth kingdom, which is the rule of Rome, you have a total of 4 that rule. And you run from Nebuchadnezzar, then you run down to the Medo-Persians, which join together. And then in the center section, that third that comes was Alexander the Great, who ruled the whole world. He moved. We're going to get into the description of these kingdoms as we get into Daniel chapter 7 and those other areas. But that next kingdom after the Medo-Persians that took them over was Alexander the Great. You guys have heard of Alexander the Great. He had a strong army, very swift, very fast, and he moved in, and they were also as far as strength, as far as numbers and those things go, they were very talented and very swift and very fast. And they moved in and they took over and defeated the Medo-Persians. And it's the Hellenish kingdom and empire that took over. And what happened was during this, they did it quickly, and they went in and defeated them. Okay? These are not the most critical issues, these nations. We'll get into the depth and description of those nations and this takeover. It is getting to the final conclusion of this statute is what matters. Okay, everybody follow? So we don't need to go into the breakdown nuts and bolts of these kingdoms yet. We will as we get primarily in Daniel chapter 7. But we're just doing an overview of what is being revealed to the king. But what we see, it says, partly of potter's clay, we know that it's made of iron, and partly of potter's clay. It will be a divided kingdom. So let's look at the statute. We have the head of gold. We have the hands that meet together, Medo-Persians. Okay, and they join together. They overtake Babylon, and now they are in control. Okay, they are the ones that are in control of of Jerusalem. And then you have Alexander the Great who comes, and he, with lots of power and speed, moves quickly and overcomes them. That's your third. And then you have a fourth. Okay, so that represents the head, the arms. Number 3 is that is bronze, that is the centerpiece. And then you have a split. It says it will be a divided kingdom. And this divided kingdom is partially made up. It's strong as iron, And that iron goes in and rules with an iron fist and destroys and breaks things up. Takes all of these others and breaks them up. So it's just like if you were to take a rod of iron and hit, say, a piece of glass or clay or something like that, it would just fragment off like this. But it doesn't completely leave. It intermixes with that iron. And it will be a divided kingdom, and that division is exactly what we see that took place, in the east versus the west. Okay? Because with Alexander the Great, when he moved, he didn't have any heirs. He had no heirs that would take over the monarchy of the throne or anything like that. So what it happened was, it was divided. He had 4 generals that were his closest confidants and that ruled for him, that controlled his army and his armies, and you had 4 generals. Well, 2 of these generals, and Alexander the Great, he died fast. He didn't have a long life and he died quickly. So now this kingdom and this rule must be distributed out. And it goes to the 4 generals. Well, 2 of them band together, and then the other 2 band together. And that's where you hear east and west. And that's why you have this statue in the timeline that goes downward of periods of history and time that's taken place. But now you have a divided kingdom, which are remember, Nebuchadnezzar's the head, okay? And as you go down, this portion here, you have the Medo-Persians come together. Then you have this portion that is bronze. Then you have the 4th, which is Rome. And it is as strong as iron. And it breaks up all of the rest into pieces, but those pieces are not done away with. In the sense like this, that what happened was, the way that we see these things, they didn't remove and say, hey, we're the monarchy rule. Kind of like you see with Nebuchadnezzar and Daniel and his friends. You're being trained and you are now Babylonian. You are no longer Jewish. You are Babylonian. And we will teach you to be Babylonian. We will give you Babylonian names. So it's not that type of a rule. What happened with that rule was it broke everything up, but it left the cultures and the ruling authorities in place. They just ruled over them. So that means that they're not taking away what you're used to in your culture and all these things. But they have ruling authority over you. So they left all of that in place. Okay, your administrations, you stay there. We just rule you. Do you get an understanding of what took place with that? So this made a tremendous difference. An absolute tremendous difference. Because at this point, Rome is ruling. And you have this 4th kingdom that comes in. But when you have, let's back up just a little bit, when you have those 4 generals and 2 come together, you have an east-west split. And that's what happened. And when that took place, that's where you have the legs. All right? When this 4th kingdom comes into place and it breaks things up, there's a split that took place. They left everything in place. You had a east and a west division. Okay, and now you have the legs of iron. One is east and one is west, that broke everything up but left everything in place. And then let's carry on, let's continue on. the toughness of iron. Let's continue on in the scripture. Everybody clear so far on what's taking place as we're moving down that statue just real briefly? We'll get into deeper details with it. And this is what we see in history. All of this is all backed up with historical documentation. So, these prophecies we can clearly see in the past. Okay? Now take a look at verse 41. Inasmuch as you saw the feet, okay, hold on one second. Verse 40 again. Then there will be a fourth kingdom as strong as iron, inasmuch as the iron crushes and shatters all things. So, like iron that breaks in pieces, it will crush and break all of these in pieces. So it's taken all of those, the rule of all those kingdoms and all of the remnant of these things, and breaks it up. And when it breaks it up, when it breaks it, it crushes and breaks all things into pieces. Verse 41. In that you saw the feet and the toes, partly of potter's clay and partly of iron. So, everybody has the picture on what we just got done explaining, correct? Partly of clay and partly of iron. So this iron that is strong and has the ability to break it all up into pieces, what is this referring to? It's referring to Gentiles. All your Gentile nations, correct? You understand that we have looked at a rule by Gentile nations. That's who these kingdoms are. Are they Jewish? No. The Jews are in exile, and they started being taken into where it began with Nebuchadnezzar. That was the head of gold. And as it goes down and each kingdom is defeated by the other, it gives way to another time period, which within this we'll dig into a little bit more. But Cyrus, at this point too, we see it goes into the book of Nehemiah, and him being a Gentile was prophesied his name before he was ever born, and he is the one that gives the order that the Jews are allowed at one point during this course to go back and rebuild the walls around Jerusalem after many years had gone by. Okay? So we'll get into all those details later. We're going to stick with this text. That takes place here also. That's where you get the book of Nehemiah, and they have been given an order because Cyrus was the ruler who said, yes, Jerusalem can be rebuilt by the Jews. So that's what took place. And that's how you get in the book of Nehemiah and read, I know what it's like to build the walls around Jerusalem. That is when that took place, and it's during the course of this time period. We'll get into the deeper details on that because I don't want to get off course with this. As the toes, verse 42, as the toes of the feet were partly of iron and partly of pottery, so some of the kingdoms will be strong and part of it will be brittle. What this speaks about, as it goes down, now we have that split, a divided kingdom that is the iron has shattered the clay, but left everything in place, and they assimilate. They just take it over, but yet they just leave everything in place. And those nations and those rules were divided and broken up, but they still exist. And with these still existing, with Santa Barbara still existing within California, within the United States of America, that is under the federal government, within that type of a system and segment, but yet ruled by the overseer, and that is the federal government brings down, and They check up on them, but leaving things in place. But it broke it all up rather than just all of it being connected. And now you have a division that took place. Remember that division, which was east and west, and it was left in place. But then Rome comes in and shatters all of that system and takes over and leaves things in place as it continues on. But you still have, like from the beginning, this split that took place between the four generals, which brings us, and that goes religiously and politically, which brings the rule of Rome. This is where Rome steps in. And now the Roman Empire is in control. And from the Roman Empire, you had that split, and you still have it to this day. And it split itself out into Europe, into various different areas. And from there, you even have the branch that went out into the west side, which is us today. The United States of America, from the west versus the east. Now you have the Eastern Orthodoxy of Roman Catholicism and the Roman Empire that exist, and that's what Putin and all of those in that area in the east fall under. So you still have to this day the east and west split. It was never uprooted. When was Rome overtaken as an empire? It never was. There is no other nation or kingdom that came in and removed Rome. It just disintegrated and kind of went out. It didn't really, it just kind of fell by the wayside. But it still existed. And the way that it existed was what we're seeing right here. This is important to understand. The iron breaks up into pieces all of these shattered pieces. And it just kind of melts in, but yet still has a controlling factor in this sense, because of the pieces that surround throughout the world, the East and the West, and in the Middle East as well. Okay? What is continuing to happen through these pieces? Well, those pieces are your governments and those that, hey, we're not under that thumb of Rome, the Roman Empire, but we're part of the piece that adheres to the iron, that sticks to the iron. It doesn't adhere in a sense that it can cling and has the ability to stick to it, but it's separate. It just doesn't mix together. But yet with enough unity to maintain one factor, the United Nations. You have a Roman umbrella that rules those. Any and all anti-Semitic is under that iron mixed with clay. Make sense? Because they're different pieces. And how is it that that works? It works like this. Is Jerusalem in control of the Jewish nation? You have a Muslim mosque that is right on their Temple Mount. Right? Is Israel in their land? You have rises, ups and downs for a short time period, and then they would go back down again. And it has been effective with the iron mixed with clay to maintain control of Jerusalem in Israel. Then 1948 comes, and Israel, from the original exile and scattered among the lands, God is bringing them, like it's prophesied, back to Israel. Can a nation be born in a day? 1948. It's born. So God had promised that he would bring them back in the land and they would possess the land. But what has taken place until the finality of it is the trampling of Jerusalem and in Israel of the Gentile nations. Meaning you are not in control. Not every single Jew is back in the nation. What has to happen, and as God is working, every Jew has to be in Israel that's alive. Okay? Every Jew. And Israel has to be in control, complete control, and will be in complete control of the entire world, and have absolute control with no Gentiles trampling or affecting the city of Jerusalem. Do you have all those factors right now? And we all know that the answer is no. So what does that tell us? That tells us that we are still in that time period. We are still in that time period of the trampling of the Gentiles. Well, you notice that's the fourth kingdom. Okay, so verse 42, as the toes of the feet were partly of iron and partly of pottery, so the kingdoms will be strong and part of it will be brittle. Verse 43. And in that you saw the iron mixed with common clay, they will combine with one another, as I just got done explaining, in the seed of men, meaning those under every man and all the men within the nations, that it is not the Lord's ruling, but according to man's way, within the seed of man, of mankind. Now we know the Antichrist is going to possess a man, and we see these rise. So it's with what has taken place is within the seed of man. That they come together this way, in unity, and that it's man's doing. And that they adhere and they work together, but they can't cling together. But yet the final effect is still efficient in holding down the Jewish nation. So you can't point the finger at one particular nation and saying, well, it's because of you guys that we don't have Jerusalem. It's because of you guys that you are the only ones that are trampling through our nation. And it's because of you guys, just a single nation, that we are not in control of Jerusalem completely, that there is Gentile infringement. So what would that be noted as? Well, let's turn to Luke 21 real quick. This is a time period, then we're going to get into, let's go to Luke 21. Luke 21, this is speaking about the time of the abomination of desolation, but notice one thing. This is a good time for us to look to this chapter, to this particular scripture. Luke 21, everybody there? Luke 21, verse 23. Woe to those who are pregnant and to those who are nursing babies in those days, for there will be great distress upon the land and wrath to this people, speaking about the Jews. Now this is at the time of mid-tribulation that it's speaking about, but notice this. Verse 24, and they will fall by the edge of the sword, by the edge of the sword, and will be led captive into all the nations, and Jerusalem will be trampled underfoot by the Gentiles until, see that? The time of the Gentiles are fulfilled. So do you see, as we move down this statue, now let's continue on in the book of Daniel, chapter 2. But until it will remain that way, that the Gentile nations are what? Trampling Jerusalem. Didn't you just see that there? Until the what? The time of the Gentiles are fulfilled. What does that mean? That word time means an epoch, a block of time. And when does that end? Is what we're trying to get at. Okay? We need to know. We're obviously living within that time period right now. But we know this, that we're in and past the fourth kingdom zone. Right? Rome came and went. It never totally fell, and it still has its effect with all those pieces that it broke up, and the iron does not mix with the clay, but it's with the clay, but it has its ability and effect to continue holding the nation Israel down. Until when? Okay, well, that's a good shot at it. We just read it in Luke 24, until the fullness of the Gentiles. And when will the fullness of the Gentiles be? Well, we're going to learn about that now. Everybody following so far? But rapture's a good one. Rapture is imminent, which means it can happen at any time. But the good point about the rapture that you brought up, Carrie, is this, is that it too ends. An epoch, a large time period, which means it gives way to a new time period, and that is, there is no more church age. That's a great point. It's a good plug for us to know that when the rapture, which has no signs,
church is out.
Right, when that happens, the church is gone, and the church is never to return on earth again. You'll have, after that time period, false church. That's it. It doesn't, the true church doesn't exist anymore, because all of us are with the Lord, never to leave the Lord again. Where the Lord is, we will be also. But that's a good point. But it's not the thing that stops, that ends this that we just read, until the fullness of the Gentiles. What ends the fullness of the Gentiles? It says, here we go. We'll find out here in the verses. And as you saw, the toes of the feet were partly of iron and partly of pottery. Some of the kingdom will be strong, and a part of it will be brittle. Verse 43. And in that you saw the iron mixed with common clay, they will combine with one another in the seed of men, but they will not adhere to one another, even as iron does not combine with pottery. Verse 44. In the days of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which will never be destroyed, and that kingdom will not be left for another people. It will crush and put an end to all of these kingdoms. It will endure forever. Verse 45. Inasmuch as you saw that a stone was cut out of a mountain without hands, and that it crushed the iron, the bronze, and the clay. Let me read that again. It will crush and put an end to all these kingdoms. What kingdoms? All four of these kingdoms. What will crush and put an end to it? The stone that was cut without hands. Now, in the law, in Deuteronomy, under the law, you could not sacrifice an animal on stones that were cut with human hands. This is an important factor to understand. You could not sacrifice, it was contrary to the law, to make a sacrifice unto the Lord on stones that a man chiseled and cut and placed them in place. This is a great salvation point as well in God's work within salvation. Okay? That being this, is that if man had something to do with this sacrifice, that's the reason behind this. That's the reason the law was set up that way. Do not put human hands and cut it up and contribute to it. It is God and God alone. It is God and God alone. That means you pick up stones and you build your altar and do not chip it, do not form it. It must be uncut by human hands. That is the same picture in God's sovereignty. Your hands are not involved in your salvation. It is God and God alone. And in the stopping of this trampling of the Gentile age, it is God and God alone that stops it. It is not political maneuvering. That's why we read the portions about men's seed in verse 43. And that you saw the iron was mixed with common clay, they will combine with one another in the seed of men. Now are you getting this overall picture as we continue on? That man's hand is not in control. What man will do politically and what they will attempt to accomplish, ecumenical-bully, they come together. Okay, they don't mix together because they don't adhere to one another, but yet the effect for a time will take place that way until what we just got done reading in Luke 21, and that is until the fullness of the trampling of the Gentiles is complete. And what completes that? That age, that block that we're talking about. Now, you were right, Carrie, in the sense that we are not here at that time that the trampling of Jerusalem is completed. We are not here when the stone comes and that is cut without hands. And what does it do? It says in verse 44, the kingdom will not be left with one people. It will crush and put an end to all these kingdoms, talking about the stone, but it itself will endure forever, inasmuch as you saw that the stone was cut out of a mountain without hands, and that it crushed the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, and the gold. All four of them. Okay? It crushed them. The great God has made known to the king. God has made known to the king what will take place in the future. So the dream is true and its interpretation is trustworthy. Let's just take a quick, brief look at this. So we have this stone, and it shows that the toes, it is this statue, that the stone without, inasmuch as you saw the stone, you saw the toes, this stone will come and strike the 10 toes of that statue. Remember, the timeline is going down from the top, from the gold, through the silver, through the bronze, right? Remember, as we go on down, and then it gets into the iron, and then the iron mixed with clay, and then it goes into the toes. And what happens is there's 10 that will rise within that clay and iron mixture, within that fourth kingdom, which are represented by the toes. And it says, let's take a look at verse 44 again. In those days, those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which will, actually we're going to go back up just a couple of more verses here, verse 42. As the toes of the feet were partly of iron and partly of pottery, so some of the kingdoms will be strong and part of it will be brittle. And in that you saw the iron mixed with common clay, they will combine with one another in the seed of men and not adhere to one another, even as iron does not combine with pottery. In the days of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which will never be destroyed, and that kingdom will be left for another people. It will crush and put to an end all of these kingdoms. But it will in itself endure forever. Inasmuch as you saw the stone which was cut of the mountain without hands, that it crushed the iron and the bronze and the clay and the silver and the gold. The great God has made known to the king what will take place in the future. So the dream is true and its interpretation is trustworthy. So what happens is this stone that is cut out of a mountain, and this mountain will become a great mountain, and these kingdoms will be crushed and destroyed, and upon Christ's return, he will strike those 10 toes, and the entire statue will go in, as we read earlier, like chaff. It will strike and it will go like chaff, meaning like powder, like it didn't exist. It removes the entire rule of God's chosen people and God's chosen city. As if it didn't exist, that he has worked out his purpose. And now, forever, as we just got done reading, okay, in that last verse, it crushes and puts an end to all of these kingdoms, but it, talking about, and it will be given to another people. Who is another people? There's only two, right, the Jews. There's only two types. And who are these that are ruling and trampling? The Gentiles. It will be given to another people, which is back to the Jews. Inasmuch as you saw that the stone that was cut out of a mountain without hands, and it crushed the iron, the bronze, and the clay, and the silver, and the gold. The great God has made known to the king what will take place in the future. So the dream is true, and its interpretation is trustworthy. Verse 46. Then King Nebuchadnezzar fell on his face and did homage to Daniel and gave orders to present him an offering and the fragrant incense. Verse 47. The king answered Daniel and said, surely your God is the God of gods and the Lord of kings and a revealer of mysteries. Since you have been able to reveal this mystery, then the king promoted Daniel and gave him many great gifts, and he made him ruler over the whole province of Babylon and chief, perfect, over all the wise men of Babylon. Do you see that verse there where it says that Daniel reveals these things and says that the interpretation is sure and it's true? Nebuchadnezzar receives it, and now he has the other half of the dream, and that's exactly what he saw, and now its interpretation has been given to him. And what was the decree, the order and decree that the king gave in the very beginning? If you're able to interpret these, talking about to the other counselors, if you're able to interpret this dream, then I will lavish you. If it is true, if you're able to do this. Well, he makes good that way with Daniel. And he sees, and notice what he says, your God, he says, which means it's Daniel's God. Your God is the God over all the other gods. But that doesn't last forever with King Nebuchadnezzar. So he knows that his time will end, and he rules, and that God has given him all providence over all nations, over everything. Okay? But it's going to end. So it's going to come to an end for you, and after you, these other kingdoms will come into place. But he's letting you know, King Nebuchadnezzar, what will take place in the future, and how these different kingdoms will come, and one will give way to another, and another will give way to that one, until the time ends. And what is that time that ends? What we just got done reading in Luke. Until the age, that time of the trampling of the Gentiles is complete. And in that text, within that text, it's speaking about tribulation, which is at the close and the end of tribulation. And what happens? What is it speaking about? Who is that stone, that rock, that is cut without human hands, that the law says you have no part in this, man has no part in this. You cannot set up a sacrifice to the living God that is cut with human hands. They must not be cut if you make a sacrifice where human hands are involved in it. And there's the sovereignty and the truth of who our God is, and it's preaching the gospel of this one who is the God of all. And it's revealed to him. And we'll see his attitude and his arrogance will be changed in God's timing. And we'll see that in the book of Daniel. So this stone comes and it defeats, and it goes up like chaff. It destroys all of it. When does that take place? Every one of these kingdoms as if they didn't exist. And then the kingdom that will last forever, it will crush and put an end to all of these kingdoms, and it will endure forever and ever. Meaning there'll be no end to the kingdom, and it will go to a different people. That means it will go from the Gentiles, and the only other people that exist on earth are the Jews. And it will go to the Jews by the hand of the Lord, and he will end, like we read in Luke 21, he will end that until the end of the age of the trampling of the Gentiles. And it ends by Christ coming back and returning. And we are not on earth when that takes place. Where are we? We have been raptured already. We come with him at that time. Okay? Now, remember we were talking about the wisdom and using discretion and Daniel given power. Here we see the interpretation given by a 16, 17, 18-year-old youth in his late teens, and he was considered the nobody, and God has raised him up. But you remember that Daniel said and gave glory to God and says, you give wisdom and you give understanding to men. You give wisdom to men and reveal things to those with understanding, to men who have understanding, who belong to the Lord. And he says, you have given me power. Well, we see at this point, watch this. We see at this point, as we go through from verse 46 on down to the rest of the chapter, then Nebuchadnezzar fell on his face and did homage to Daniel and gave orders to present him an offering and fragrant incense. Verse 47, the king answered Daniel and said, surely your God is the God of gods and Lord of kings and a revealer of mysteries. Since you have been able to reveal this mystery, verse 48, then the king promoted Daniel and gave him many great gifts, and he made him ruler over the whole province of Babylon and chief perfect over all the wise men of Babylon. So now you have this kid, this young man who was able to do this, and it was given to him. You have all those others that have been politically established. So you can imagine how they're not going to like Daniel. And now immediately he is promoted to rule all of them. And not only that, over the provinces. He's the statesman. He has rule over all the areas. And this is given to him by King Nebuchadnezzar. Now watch this. Remember we spoke about Daniel and how it is that he was given power. Well, this power just now became highly effective to the most powerful man on earth. And he is received. And what does he do? He receives in promotion from Nebuchadnezzar by God's will and raised from the very bottom, the least, up to authority and oversight of all of those that are liars and conjurers and all those guys that are fakes. So they're going to do whatever they can. They don't like Daniel. But look at, like Daniel said, he used discretion and he used wisdom and trusted in the Lord. And verse 49, so he is now ruler of all these areas. And verse 49 says, let me find verse 49. And Daniel made a request of the king, and he appointed, we know this, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego over the administration of the province of Babylon, while Daniel was at the king's court. Incredible. Here is Daniel exercising the power that God gave him, and he rose up. And using wisdom, using discretion, I can't trust these guys that I'm in control of. And Daniel is directly from the king's court at the king's palace. And as soon as he receives from the king this promotion, he uses instantaneous wisdom and discretion and the power that he has been given, saying unto himself, I got enemies now, knowing this. I am ruler not only over them, but the providences also. I'm head over all of these things. And immediately, the first thing he does, I have no one I can trust, even if I'm in control of all these things. King, he makes a request. Could you promote my 3 buddies? And now Daniel has the only men that he can trust and count on. And they now have power. And you see what it says? It says, verse 49, and Daniel made a request to the king, and he appointed Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego over the administration of the province of Babylon. So these guys are the heads of state over all of Babylon. Now he has in place, wisely I might add, those that he can trust and he can use, and they rule all of Babylon, while Daniel is in the king's court. Pretty amazing. But that we pull from verses back where we see him using that discretion, using that wisdom, and also realizing, God, you have given me, Yahweh, you have given me power. We didn't see that power until we come through the rest of this text and we see that power exercised. And now he has literally been given into his hands the authority and the power under the most powerful in all of the world. It's pretty amazing. And that's what God, it's not that, hey, that's what God, he's going to do that for everybody. It is that Lord's will is much grander and better than what we will for ourselves. Trusting the Lord, our sovereign God, who is completely in control of all things, placing that trust even in the worst of circumstances, even to the point that you're going to be put to death. And that's what we see here, and that gives the explanation as we're going to button up the rest. We go from gold to silver to bronze, to iron to mixed with clay. Then the 10 toes, when Christ returns, strikes the 10 toes, and this entire statue, which is a timeline of history that's going to take place, hitting the 10 toes within that Roman kingdom. It's a revised Roman Empire that never completely was exhausted. So then Christ returns, as we read. When is that time? That time is at the close during tribulation, Luke 21, like we just read, that the full time of that age time period of the trampling of the Gentiles ends. It's known as the trampling of the Gentiles, correct? What's the difference between the trampling of the Gentiles, age, that goes until Christ returns? And we'll just briefly go over this here. It says at the end he hits the toes. He destroys all of their rule, establishes after that, we know the interval time period that takes place in Daniel chapter 12, establishes the 1,000-year reign, kingdom ends at the trampling of the Gentiles, all other rule, and then there is the stone that was cut from a mountain that has no end, that grows. And this is the establishment of your kingdom. Okay, it's a mountain that will endure forever and ever. And it will go to a different people, not the Gentiles, to another people, which is only one other people, that being the Jewish nation. And that happens at the end of Great Tribulation. And Nebuchadnezzar is the picture of the one to come in the future, who rules over all of the world and has complete control of that world futuristically during these blocks of time. And we see blocks of time that take place within this time period during the trampling of Jerusalem, of the Gentiles. And then God ends it, and it returns back to his people. And that kingdom goes on forever and ever. All right? And when what is the difference between the trampling, like we read, trampling of the Gentiles till the end of that age, and is there another age called the fullness of the Gentiles? Yep, there is, right?
Yep.
So there's trampling of the Gentiles, which we just got done reading when that ends. It ends at the end of when? Tribulation. When Christ returns.
That's it.
That's that, and it's called an age right there in Luke. Okay? When that age ends. Now, there's also another age, which is the fullness we see in here. We see Paul making reference to, and that is that all of Israel will be saved, that when the fullness of the Gentiles come in. What is the difference between fullness of the Gentiles and trampling of the Gentiles?
Oh, the rapture.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Oh,
The
yeah.
rapture
Oh,
of
yeah.
the... I knew that you knew it. You know, it's easy to get confused. Okay, how does that work? One is the fullness of the Gentiles,
Right.
the fullness of the Gentile time period. It's ended. That means the church age.
Right.
It's the fullness of Gentiles. Why is it the fullness of Gentiles? Because judgment came down on Israel when they didn't receive their Messiah. Therefore, the gospel will go out to the Gentiles. You will no longer, for a time, you're going to be put on pause. You're going to be put on pause. And then during tribulation time, when that time comes, Daniel's 70th week, then the rest of the fulfillment according to the covenant will be completed to break the pride of the Jewish nation and to pay according what they owe in the covenant, in the heat, in the fiery furnace that will turn and bring them unto, crying out to their Lord, and they will look upon the one whom they have pierced, in Zechariah. Okay? So, and God will save them in the last 3 days. Remember that study? You know, he would save all those that are in Jerusalem and everybody's there. Our Revelation study. And then at that time, they will cry out. Remember? They will be just prostrate on the ground and cry out. And each one in their own house. And that will kindle, as they cry out to the Lord's return, and that's where all the world will see. We see darkness everywhere, that every eye will see, and every eye will see his return, and he's returning with us, because all of the heavenly stars and all that is blacked out. We don't need to get it. We got all those in our studies, right? In our Revelation studies. So we're speaking about at the time of the end. That is the trampling of the Gentiles. And like Nico said correctly, the fullness of the Gentiles, okay, is the time period that belongs to the church age. Because the Jews rejected, you're no longer the mouthpiece for God. It will go, the gospel and being the mouthpiece will go out to the Gentile nations, and that's who we are. And that's known as the church age. That's what Christ set in order. The Jews rejected that, and at his crucifixion, just prior, he pronounced judgment on Israel and said the gospel will go out to the Gentiles. So when the fullness of that time period age is full, that's why we don't know the exact day out when that's full. That's why it was left open. No one knows the day or the hour when the authority that is within the Father's authority says it's time. The fullness of the Gentiles. The last Gentile within the church age has been saved. And the rapture takes place. And that ends the church age. It gives way to a different age. That dispensation ends. And it gives way to another time. The activity, there is no church after that. There's a false church that's claiming to be, it's a false religion. And all your false religions come together under the Babylonian system. Excommunicable. Oh, we're all one God, and all this, and worship that, and then we see the destruction of that system, and all that stuff takes place during tribulation, and then at the close of tribulation, the stone that's cut without hands comes, and every eye will see him, and we are with him because we've been with him since we got raptured. And he returns and destroys and takes complete control, destroys the trampling of the Gentiles in Jerusalem, and takes control of Jerusalem. But I need to back up. Yeah, he will come and he takes control, but does he land in Jerusalem?
No.
Does he land on the Mount of Olives? No. We all know that. Okay, good. Just seeing if you guys are on your toes.
Like Lily Pop.
He goes to Petra, right? He goes to Basra. And then he comes into Jerusalem. You guys remember? Okay. Good job. You're right, Carrie. Good thinking. Now you guys are getting on your toes. That's good. Right, Manny?
Yep.
Does that make sense to you guys? So you have the fullness of the Gentiles, and you have the trampling of the Gentiles. Fullness of the Gentiles is us. We're the Gentiles that are saved. And any Jew that is saved during this time period. Jill, we all know Jill. My wife, she's Jewish. 100% Jew, but she's within the church age. She's a Christian. Like Paul, the Apostle Paul and Peter and all other Christians. The remnant, God has always had his remnant that belong to him that don't fit outside of that box. So all Jewish believers, if you take an Amir or any of these Jewish believers, they're within the church body, within the church age. They're part of the church. Just like we see all of those apostles. They're all within the church. Suffering the persecution of the Jews and the other religions and those things. Okay? So, everybody good with that? I could go on and on. I hope I didn't confuse you and cough too much and all that, but everybody good with that? Good. If you have any questions, let me know. But that is an overview. That is the chapter in Daniel chapter 2. Now we'll get into breaking down as we go through the book of Daniel. It would just get greater and greater, and we'll look at the internal workings of each one of these kingdoms, especially in Daniel chapter 7. Okay? So I hope I didn't jump around too much there, but that completes the statute. That completes our doughboy. So, but anyways, that's what I just got done explaining is basically what all of this is. And this line that is here, okay, Daniel 2:45, Israel's time of the trampling of the Gentiles since Babylon. What did I write here? Moses and the law, the prophet, and John the Baptist. Prior to Babylon, okay, that's just explaining things we've already explained. Okay, then fullness of the Gentiles in age, fullness of the Gentiles age is complete. That's the rapture of the church. Okay, then after that, God's purpose, it's God's purpose. The purpose for the church is complete. Now, what it does is Daniel's 70th week. It goes 69 and then 70. And that 70 is this time period, Daniel's 70th week that we'll get into, okay, in Daniel chapter 9. And that's the 7 years of tribulation. The church is no longer here. It's been raptured. And the covenant is being completed with the covenant nation Israel. That we're not part of that covenant. We're not part of that covenant. And that's what's being completed. And God uses that to bring his nation Israel, like it says here, to their knees, break their pride, and uses the tribulation of the judgments that they are owed according to the law and the covenant, and uses Satan, uses all demonic power, uses all of those things at his disposal and his sovereign purpose. So I hope that gives you an overview. Does that give you an overview? And then the time of the end comes, and that's what we just got done reading. That time of tribulation we just looked at, the last portion on the chart, and that's when Christ returns and strikes all the nations, and that's when he destroys them all. And we went through that study in Revelation. Everybody good? So that's just like an overview there.
Hello friends, this is Manny from the channel. I do the editing, and I just wanted to pop in and say thank you for watching. We appreciate you guys, and we hope you enjoyed. If you want to contribute in any way, you know the drill. Like, comment, subscribe, share, anything helps. So we hope you'll join us again next time as Derek teaches the Word of God. Thanks.